To really begin talking about biology, there's a few things about chemistry that are important to understand. The reason for everything that happens inside of a living thing is ultimately chemical reactions. We won't get down to that level of detail in most things we study, but learning about it first will give you an appreciation for how complex and beautiful all life is. Chemical reactions take place on a very small scale but have enormous effects in our bodies. It all begins with the behavior of tiny particles called electrons, which are part of every atom. These two atoms in a fight illustrate one of the most important properties of atoms, their ability to gain or lose negatively charged electrons. It's the first step in some chemical reactions. Atoms are the building blocks of all matter. The periodic table shows that there are many different types of atoms called elements, which each have unique properties due to their structure. All atoms have similar structure. They all have a dense, heavy nucleus in the center made of two smaller particles, sometimes called subatomic particles because they're smaller than an atom. Protons have a positive charge and neutrons are neutral. The number of protons in an atom determines what element that atom is. In comparison to electrons, they're very large. Electrons move around the nucleus and have a negative charge. Since they're very small and held in place because of their attraction to the protons in the nucleus, it's easy to remove the outermost electrons from an atom. This allows them to form chemical bonds. So, the number of protons determines what element an atom is and gives it its properties, and the number of electrons determines how the atom will react around other atoms and form chemical bonds. Removing electrons from a neutral atom creates an ion. Where do these electrons go? Well, they get added into atoms that easily accept electrons. You may have learned in junior high that electrons in an atom are arranged into orbitals, and the atoms always want to have 8 electrons in its outermost orbital. That's what the red lines in the model show. And that's why the sodium ion has an 8 E minus on its outermost ring. 8 negative electrons. If you didn't learn about this in junior high, you'll learn much more about it next year in chemistry. But for now, it's most important to know that some atoms more easily lose electrons and some atoms more easily gain electrons. Whether they gain or lose electrons, any atom without the same number of protons as electrons is called an ion because it's charged. If it gains electrons, it's negatively charged, like the chlorine ion. And if it loses electrons, then it's positively charged, like the sodium ion. Atoms of the same element can also have different numbers of neutrons. They can't gain or lose these like they do electrons. Different forms of the atom just occur naturally. Atoms with different numbers of neutrons are called isotopes. Some isotopes are unstable and break down at fixed rates. When they break down, one of their extra neutrons turns into a proton. Because the atom essentially gains protons, it becomes an entirely different atom. These radioactive isotopes have many interesting uses in science. Scientists are able to tell how old fossils are by comparing the amounts of different carbon isotopes. You may have heard of this referred to as carbon dating. There is a fixed ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 found in nature. Carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, and carbon-14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. When an organism dies, it stops adding new carbon atoms to its body because it stops eating. Carbon-14 is always breaking down though, so the less carbon-14 a fossil contains, the older it is. If it's too old, scientists have to look at different radioactive isotopes that take longer to break down, or decay as it's usually called. Radioactive isotopes can be harmful to our bodies in large doses. They can kill our cells by damaging the DNA inside the nucleus. This is most harmful to cells that are dividing quickly, like cancer cells. Radioactive isotopes can also be used as kinds of markers to locate particular atoms in a body. So if a scientist wanted to know how your body uses the element iodine you eat, and if you look at the container of salts, that's why it's called iodized salts, because it contains iodine. A scientist can give you a radioactive iodine, and then look for where in your body there's radioactivity. They would find it in your neck. in the butterfly-shaped gland called your thyroid, which controls your metabolism. The periodic table tells us there are about 118 different elements, but atoms of these elements can arrange themselves into almost an infinite number of compounds. A compound is a combination of atoms in specific proportions. For example, one of the most common compounds on Earth, water, is made up of two elements, hydrogen and oxygen, in a specific ratio. Two hydrogen atoms to every one oxygen atom. Compounds are created through the formation of chemical bonds. There are two types of bonds that occur between atoms. And there's a third type of bond that occurs between specific compounds called molecules. We'll get to those a little later. The first type of bond that occurs between atoms is called an ionic bond. They're called ionic bonds because they form when two ions join together. The first step in forming an ionic bond is that electrons are transferred between two atoms. One gives up one or more electrons to become a positive ion and gives those electrons to another atom, which becomes a negative ion. Then, because one is positive and the other is negative, the two are attracted to each other and form an ionic bond. Not all atoms are able to give up their electrons, though. Carbon, for example, has 4 electrons in its outermost orbital, and removing all 4 would take a lot of energy. So atoms that don't easily gain or lose electrons are able to form chemical bonds by sharing electrons. These bonds are called covalent bonds. Co means together, and the electrons in the outermost orbital or energy level are called valence electrons. So covalent means 2 or more atoms put together their electrons in the outermost energy level. Compounds formed by covalent bonds are called molecules. The electrons that are shared move around the nuclei of both atoms, which make these bonds very strong. They don't always share the electrons evenly, though. For example, in water, hydrogen shares its electron with oxygen. Because oxygen has more protons than hydrogen, the electron they share is more attracted to the oxygen, so it spends more time near the oxygen nucleus. This makes the oxygen end of the molecule slightly negative and the hydrogen end slightly positive. Even though the molecule overall doesn't have a charge, it's neutral, one end is slightly negative and one end is slightly positive. These types of molecules are called polar. Polar molecules are able to stick to other polar molecules through weak bonds called van der Waals forces. This is why water forms droplets. Using this Venn diagram, compare and contrast the 3 types of bonds, ionic, covalent, and van der Waals forces.